we are again, Ash. And
hello
everybody. Smashing those subscribe buttons. And we had some lovely comments recently as well. I've had some lovely comments on Facebook recently. Someone came into the Jekyll and Hyde one last week and they thought it was wonderful, the way that we're doing this, and made them think about the story, which is all we can ever ask for. That and fame and fortune are the only things that we can ever ask for.
Naked women.
I think that doesn't that go with fame and fortune? I think that's.
I'm just wanting to make sure it happens. Yeah,
I'm sure if you got a lawyer that can write an NDA, you can get naked women when you're rich. Something like that. Well,
that's all I ask for. I'm just a humble person.
So please excuse me this week. I am full of a cold, so I may be coughing. And if I go off camera to sniff something, I'm not like being old Hollywood and taking up a nice line of the devil's dandruff. I am just going off to take some Vicks. Honest.
But if I go off camera to sniff something, it's definitely it's some of the cocaines.
Well, yes, I do have you on camera a couple of episodes ago where you actually say, I'm just going off some coke. So.
Oh, yeah.
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 We have evidence.
Hoisted by my own petard, yes.
So,
am I allowed to share my screen for a second?
Oh, yes, go ahead. Oh, this is interesting. Something new.
Yeah.
What have we got here?
So if I share my screen, the host has disabled participants.
Oh, hang on a second. How does that work?
It's just I've actually got an image of the magazine cover that this story first appeared in.
Oh, wow. Oh, no, that would be cool. But I'm just trying to find where that is, where you can change that. There we go. Share screen. There we go. Try that now.
Oh, brilliant stuff. Thank you. Yeah. So that would be there. And then click share. Nope, definitely don't want to look at that.
There we go. What's on this then?
I don't even know what that is.
Is that some sort? That looks like some sort of strange site where you can buy, like. Oh, look at that! Weird Tales. Weird Tales, the unique magazine. And I love the fact that this is the magazine that first featured the Call of Cthulhu as a story, and they've illustrated the front cover with a picture of a story called The Ghost Table. Yeah.
Which sounds like the shittest short story ever.
We're going to have to find it.
The first short story, no, it wasn't the first, but one of the earliest short stories I had published was called The Unhappy Table, which was sort of like mainly sexual in content, but The Ghost Table just sounds like...
And it doesn't look like much of a ghost, really, does it? I mean, it looks more like a panther table to me. Should be called the cat table or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's got Queen Anne legs, so it's definitely not scary.
Or the werewolf table would have been scary.
Yeah,
maybe.
But yeah, that's an image. That's the image of the ghost table with that bloke who's got hands that look a little bit Trumpy-like, with them being so small.
One of the things I quite like about this as well is just to place this in a historical time, which we don't do very much. But this week is when No Time to Die James Bond comes out. And it's if you cut the table off, it's very reminiscent of the old James Bond covers, I think.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was looking at something about propaganda the other week where, we've got a fainting, frail woman there, and a man with a gun. Yes.
Yes. You can even hear it, can't you? Oh, no.
Yeah,
the table. Oh, it's all right. I've got a gun. That'll finish off any ghosts.
And particularly ghost tables, yeah. That's what,
Reginald Arnold, known for shooting his furniture.
Right, so synopsis, yes?
Yeah, well, first of all, this week we have been reading...
We have been reading The Call of Cthulhu.
Yes.
Or Cthulhu, or Cthulhu. The Call of the Speech Impediment.
The Call of the Nobody Knows.
Brace yourself in, because this is going to be a long one. There's a double entendre there. Call of Cthulhu is presented as a manuscript found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. In the text, Thurston recounts his discovery of notes left behind by his grand-uncle George Gammell Angel, a prominent professor of Semitic languages at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, who died suddenly in the winter of 1926 to 27 after being jostled by a nautical-looking Negro. And that, I think, is important because we're going to be mentioning H.P. Lovecraft's racism.
Yes.
So it moves on to the part that's called the horror in clay, and this concerns a small bas-relief sculpture found among the papers, which the narrator describes, saying, "My somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, a pulpy, tentacled head surmounted by a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings." So the sculpture turns out to be the work of Henry Anthony Wilcox, a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, who based the works on his dreams of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. These images are associated in the dreams with the words Cthulhu and I'm going to go with Aah, or Aah, yeah. Anyway, Wilcox's dreams began on March 1st, 1925, culminating in a period from March 23rd until April 22nd, when Wilcox was in a state of delirium. During the same period, Angel's research reveals there were cases of outre mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly or mania around the world, from Paris and London, Africa and South America, Haiti and the Philippines, Western Ireland and India, in New York City, hysterical Levantines mob police, in California, a Theosophist colony dons white robes to await a glorious fulfillment. And if you've lived in California and not had a glorious fulfillment, I don't know what you're doing. Then we move on to the tale of Inspector Legrasse. In the second part of the story, Angel's notes revealed that the professor had heard the word Cthulhu and seen a similar image much earlier at the 1908 meeting of the American Archaeological Society in St. Louis, Missouri. A New Orleans police official named John Raymond Legrasse had asked the assembled antiquarians to identify a statuette made of an unidentifiable greenish-black stone that had been captured some months before in the wooded swamp south of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, closely resembled the Wilcox bas-relief. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, scaly, rubber-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, with a somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. On November 1st, 1907, Legrasse had led a party in search of several women and children who disappeared from a squatter community. The police found the victims' oddly marked bodies being used in a ritual centered on the statuette, about which roughly 100 men, all of a very low, mixed-blooded and mentally aberrant type, were brain-bellowing and writhing, repeatedly chanting the phrase, bear with me on this, Funglar, Mungunaknak, Cthulhu, Earlier, Wiga, Ngel, Fdang.
Are they from Leeds?
Yes, all of them. After killing five of the participants and arresting 47 others, Legrasse interrogated the prisoners and learned the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men and who came to the young world and to the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea. But their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first men who formed a cult which had never died, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu from his dark house in the mighty city of Aah, under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. The prisoners identified the statuette as Great Cthulhu and translated the chanted phrase as, in his house at Aah, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. One particularly talkative cultist known as old Castro named this centre of the cult as Irem, the city of pillars in Arabia, and points out a relevant passage in the Necronomicon. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. One of the academics queried by Legrasse, this is William Channing Webb, a professor of anthropology at Princeton University, points out that he had encountered high up on the West Greenland coast a similar phenomenon on an 1860 expedition. A singular tribe or cult of degenerate Esquimaux, I think that was Eskimo actually, whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. Webb said that the Greenland cult had both the same chant and a similar hideous fetish. Thurston, the narrator, notes that at this point in his investigation, my attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were. And then we move on to the third part of the story. And I appreciate this has been a very long synopsis, but I think it's a fairly complicated story and needs a lengthy précis. So yeah, we've got the madness from the sea. And in the third part, the madness from the sea, Thurston extends the inquiry into the Cthulhu cult beyond what Professor Angel had discovered. He discovers by chance an article from the Sydney Bulletin, an Australian newspaper, for April 18, 1925, that reported the discovery of a derelict ship in the Pacific Ocean with only one survivor, Norwegian sailor Gustav Johansen, second mate on the schooner Emma out of Auckland, New Zealand, which on March 22nd encountered a heavily armed yacht, the Alert, crewed by, quote, a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-castes from Dunedin, New Zealand. After the Alert attacked without provocation, the crew of the Emma fought back and, though losing their own ship, managed to board the opposing ship and kill all their attackers. The article went on to say that the survivors encountered an island the next day in the vicinity of blah, 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 blah. Even though there are no charted islands in that area. Most of the remaining crew died on the island, but Johansen is said to be queerly reticent about what happened to them. Thurston realizes from the article that the crew of the Alert was connected with the Cthulhu cult, travels first to New Zealand and then to Australia, where he sees a statue retrieved from the Alert with a cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings and hieroglyph pedestal, and finally to Oslo, where he learns that Johansen died suddenly after an encounter with two Lascar sailors. When Johansen's widow gives Thurston a manuscript written in English that her husband left behind, the narrator learns of the crew's discovery of the uncharted island, which is described as a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of Aah, exploring the risen land, which is abnormal, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. The sailors managed to open a monstrously carven portal and form the newly opened depths. From the newly opened depths, it lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway. The stars were right again, and what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After years, great Cthulhu was loose again and ravening for delight. Thurston or Johansen writes that the thing cannot be described, though the story does call it the green sticky spawn of the stars, and refers to its flabby claws and awful squid head with writhing feelers. Hinting at its scale, the story says a mountain walked or stumbled. Johansen manages to get back to the yacht when Cthulhu hesitantly enters the water to pursue the ship. Johansen turns the Alert around and rams the creature's head, which bursts with a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, only to immediately begin reforming. After reading this manuscript, Thurston ends his own narrative on a pessimistic note. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. He assumes that he will soon meet the fate of Angel and Johansen. I know too much and the cult still lives. He also thinks that Cthulhu, whilst restoring his broken head, was dragged down again with the sinking city, thus keeping humanity safe until the next time when the stars are right. Yeah, sorry. I've been looking for a briefer summary, and I was obviously going to.
that when this was published in book form, it was the largest back cover of any book. It's like a whole world record for how big the back cover is, just to fit that.
Just ludicrous. I've stolen that off Wikipedia because, or somewhere online, I can't remember where now. But yeah, and it's just such a complex story, really, isn't it?
It is. It's got huge amounts of layers on it, all the way from the language used through to some of the things insinuated at, through to the bits that you can actually mock it for as well, like it goes to great pains at the end to describe something as undescribable that it had already described earlier on in the story. That thing there, yes. It already described it and then said it was undescribable. But then I actually realized that that's not actually what happened. And that's where I've read this story, about 20, 30 times over the years, right?
Right.
Because I'm a big role player. I don't just mean my stature. I mean and Cthulhu or Thulu or Kululu, we'll come to that in a minute, is one of the big role-playing games, Call of Cthulhu. So at a very young age, I was introduced to the H.P. Lovecraft stuff, and particularly that story and the Mountains of Madness were the two main stories that everything seemed to kind of be based off. And it was only on this one that I suddenly had the epiphany that it isn't actually, he's already described it early in the story and now he's describing it as undescribable, because you're not actually listening to the narrator. You're listening to the narrator read documents written by someone else.
Yes.
So that I thought was, and suddenly it dawned on me that's what was going on, and it suddenly became even more genius because of that.
I take it then that you enjoyed this one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Bloody loved it enormously.
I mean, one of the things that I like about this is the fact that we've got somebody reading a story that somebody's written down, which is then goes into further detail because the story that's written down takes on details that somebody else has written down. And then we start to realise that everybody who's written about this and read about this has come to a nasty end.
Yes.
Which gives you that whole meta feel that, perhaps I shouldn't be reading about this. Perhaps I'm going to come to a nasty end now that I know about this whole mythos.
Well, when you get further into the mythos, that's actually part of it. I mean, the Mountains of Madness, which got adapted into a film, The Mouth of Madness, really goes into it in a big way in that, because like I say, it's in the role-playing games. And this is where I'm looking at writing a thesis on role-playing games doing this, because the mythos that they go into in the role-playing game is incredible. As a reader behind reading H.P. Lovecraft, the layers that they put into the game just to create a mechanic is quite incredible. And they're saying that basically the more you know, the crazier you are, because your human brain can't handle the information that you are learning about. And so, and it becomes dangerous. You as a person become dangerous with that amount of knowledge, that the cult can't leave you alive with the knowledge that you have, because you could actually bring about the end of the world just by reading somebody else's account of it, because knowing is enough to be powerful.
This is one of the themes that runs through it, this whole idea of ignorance and knowledge. And he does start off, I think, in the opening lines, saying that we live in is it a sea of ignorance, or a placid island of ignorance? I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it's almost as though he's revering ignorance. He's revering the lack of knowledge.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah. I think there's some major points that he's making all the way through, and that is one of them. In a funny sort of way, it's kind of like the irony of it is sort of saying that knowledge in itself is dangerous, but knowledge is power. So ignorance is not power. That's one of the underlying themes all the way through it. And the other one I love is the dream as well, because that kind of goes into, it's not just academic knowledge. It's the artists. It was all the artists and the poets and the sculptors that shared the dream as Cthulhu awoke. It wasn't the academics.
When's it going to be safe for me to mention racism?
Oh, just bring it up at any time. You know, we're in safe company here.
Right, he was a racist prick. He was a complete racist dickhead, and we can sort of like see the racism coming out in this.
But that's the. I'm not going to defend racism here. Okay, I'd like to state this right now. What I'm about to say is not defending racism. It is written as from basically like a white privilege gaze. So the person writing it has a particular thing, and the words that he's using are very of its time. They weren't using other words at that time, other than words like half caste, for example, which, funnily enough, back in the 80s was still a recognized way of describing someone of mixed race. So it's only a very recent thing that the world has caught up with these words not being a good thing. But he was, just read about his life. He was racist. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, his poetry shows us. If anybody's unfamiliar with it, Google Lovecraft poetry and racist, and you'll sort of you'll come away from it and think, do you know what? They were right. If you were there thinking, anyway, so we've got a nautical Negro who jostles one of the characters, and the guy ends up dead because of it.
Yes.
We've got Mongoloids and deranged Eskimos.
Yeah.
It's anybody who's from another culture who's presented as the evil characters in this, which I think you're absolutely right. Of its time, this is what we expected. I mean, it's not just with Lovecraft. With an awful lot of the stories, the Doc Savage stories.
Doc Savage is particularly very, very sort of Victorian Empire attitude towards things, as is, to be perfectly honest with you, there's always Enid Blyton, if you ever get to read the original Enid Blyton, not the ones that they now publish, because for all the people that argue about not changing art, they have done that a huge amount with Enid Blyton, and I don't think it's suffered for it. I think kids can continue to enjoy wonderful children's stories without having, the frightfulness of the racism in it.
Absolutely. And I think the whole idea of racism, I think that's one of the key things that we've got within the story, because he's looking down on people who are from other cultures and looking down on people who've got less knowledge. But he also seems to think that we, as beautiful humans, can aspire to be these mountainous Cthulhu creatures if we evolve even further.
Yes, I think that's I think that's fair comment to say that. That's what he's looking at, and he's looking at it in a way of both worlds. In terms of, he's looking down at, it's very much kind of like, because he was American, wasn't he? So he's looking at coming from the Americas. So it's not like, there's ever been any arrogant Americans that think that the world should just all
never heard of one. No, they're all lovely.
It's just, they fully understand other people's cultures, like the Brits do. But so it's not a multicultural message, but it is an interesting message in terms of intelligence and moving away from that academic and having the arts in there, because he does, have this whole, he's not calling the artists complete lunatics. He starts off by doing that, but then you kind of realize that no, they're tapped. He's saying that artists are actually tapped into something that academics need to understand, that they're not just lunatics, that they are actually sort of like almost pulling what they do from the actual universe itself. And this is how this is all sort of coming together. And so the academics can study what the artists do. That seems to be the way it goes, especially as the description when he goes to see the sculptor, because he starts off being really scathing about the sculptor before he goes there and just thinks he's some foreigner who's tried it on with this 91-year-old man. And then after talking to him, he comes away with a different viewpoint of what's actually occurred. It's now some foreigner that's had a dream and might actually be telling the truth.
I'm going to go into inspiration here, because there were quite a few sources potentially for the inspiration. And the first thing that we've got is somebody suggesting that the horror in the clay came from one of Lovecraft's own dreams that he had in about 1919, which he described briefly in 2 different letters sent to his friend Reinhard Kleiner. In the dream, Lovecraft is visiting an antiquity museum in Providence, attempting to convince the aged curator there to buy an odd bas-relief that Lovecraft himself had sculpted. The curator initially scoffs at him for trying to sell something recently made to a museum of antique objects. Lovecraft then remembers himself answering the curator with the response, why do you say that this thing is new? The dreams of men are older than brooding Egypt, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon, and this was fashioned in my dreams. And obviously, there are very similar thoughts being said. I mean, it's practically a word-for-word quote of what we end up with in the story. And are we seeing some of Lovecraft's arrogance in here? That he's sort of like putting himself into the story as the role of the artist who's created this, the role of the artist who's tapped into this extraordinary knowledge.
Well, I think that's been a debate for a long time. When you look at, I think to look at things like the pronunciation of Cthulhu or Cthulhu, right, is a good way of indicating that. When you sit there and you look at the way that it's spelled, Chulu, right? Now, as kids, we used to say Cthulhu because that's how it looks. And then as you get older, someone tells you you don't pronounce the C, or you half pronounce the C. So there's either Thulu or Cthulhu. So you're doing those type of pronunciations. And then I read a thing which is somebody asked H.P. Lovecraft how you pronounce it. And his response, I'm not going to know it word for word, was basically that his name is beyond the understanding of man, and that the letters themselves are of such a high intelligence that they do not sound as they look, and therefore it is a completely different pronunciation, which is Cthulhu, which Khlullo, right, as being the actual phonetic pronunciation of it. And you kind of sit there and go, well, why didn't you just write that then? You've just written that now. Why didn't you write that in the thing? Because all the way through, people are reading this word and say, I know it as Rylian, as Ryle, the name of the city, and as Rylian is the name of the language. But it's like you say, but you don't know, do you? It was Rylian or Rally, or, it was whatever he decided it was to be pronounced. And so I think there was a certain amount of an arrogant smile at writing it one way and then telling everybody that's not how you pronounce it. So he's kind of telling everyone, oh, no, you go and read my story, but you're not going to understand it because you're not me, and you're not going to get all the language because you're not me. So I do agree that I think there is a huge amount of arrogance within the story itself, and a huge amount of setup arrogance as well, so that he can be contrary with people when they ask him about it.
I mean, I think one of the things that we can definitely see from this is that it was written before audiobooks were a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think his ideas were... No, I'm not trying to be disingenuous to him. I really, really love the story.
Yeah, but you couldn't imagine him going down to the local cafe and reading it out loud to people. It's one of those really weird ones. And again, I was doing in a way what we've done with all of these. I read it again and I listened to an audio recording of it, which is really interesting. Hearing somebody try and get their mouth around all these different words, it's really strange.
It's such a challenge, yeah. It really, really is. And yeah, so things being inspired by dreams, yeah, I get that. I think we discussed that when we were looking at Jekyll and Hyde, about things being inspired by dreams. We've also got somebody suggesting that the irregular sonnet The Kraken, published in 1830 by Alfred Tennyson, was a major inspiration, since both reference a huge aquatic creature sleeping for an eternity at the bottom of the ocean and destined to emerge from its slumber in an apocalyptic age. Do you think that's fair?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I actually think the poem of the Kraken is influenced just by the Greek mythos, where the Kraken actually comes from as the god of the deep, that that gets summoned to come up and is one of the major titans on Earth. That's all where it comes from, to be perfectly honest with you. I think the idea of ancient gods sleeping are just old Greek myths. So yes, it may have sparked something. He may have read that and may have sparked something, and then he's written a completely different story off the back of that as the main premise. But I wouldn't say that could be the definitive source, being as the source of a big, wieldy, tentacled beast that lives below the sea, has been around for probably as long as people have been on the ocean. It's one of the classic ocean tales as well, isn't it? The giant octopuses and squids that come and take ships down.
And here there be dragons written on maps where they got no idea what was going on beyond that point.
Even Jules Verne in 2000 Leagues Under the Sea, I think he refers to it as a kraken as well. It's a very old story, and I think it's, like I say, it's an old thing that lives under the sea, which goes back to taking the Greek mythos and bringing it into a modern day. And then Lovecraft has taken that one step further. So I can see that it's an inspiration, but not necessarily a direct inspiration. It might have been a number of different things that fueled his imagination.
I mean, I think one of the things that I like about it is the fact that the horror that we encounter in there is so far in the distance. What we're encountering is narrative tension all the way, and it's just building story and mystery and what's going on and what's going to happen. And by the time we get to stuff like Mr. Squidhead at the end of it, we've not we've been built up with so much horror that it is something fairly horrifying, but it's almost as though Cthulhu is a very small part of the story, that the rest of the horror within it is that whole mystery surrounding it, and this whole cultish attitude of trying to keep secrets, almost like it's almost like a homage to conspiracy theories, really, isn't it?
But it's all the way through, isn't it? When you go back and look at it, and it was very interesting that he mentions things like futurism and cubism as different schools of art when he's talking about it. And then you can read things like Dennis Weekly with his Devil series, things like The Devil Rides Out and The Devil a Daughter. And it's the same idea, that the horror itself comes from the cult keeping secrets, not the secret itself.
Yes.
So and I think that's where this comes across, because he's written the end of the world that's just sat there underneath the ice cap. And so the idea is, if you know that that's there, if you have the knowledge, it's like having the knowledge of your own death, isn't it? If you know the exact day that you're going to die, then you're going to live your life completely differently from not knowing when you're going to die. So if you suddenly had the knowledge of, there's this thing under the ice cap that's going to come out and it's going to smash us all to pieces because we are just insignificant to them in their age and size and meaning in the universe, then that just strips hope away. So that there's a lot of horror in that, but you couldn't really have that as a main protagonist that you're fighting against, because you can't beat it. So you have to have that horror and tension in a different way.
I mean, you say that about knowing the date that you're going to die. My granddad actually knew the day he was going to die. A judge told him. And one of the things, I mean, we talk about inspiration. We can sort of like see how parts of this have inspired Stephen King. And I know Stephen King is a huge fan of Lovecraft. But the fact that we've got things occurring in 1860, in 1908, and then 1920 something, this is almost the same way. It turned 35 this week.
Yeah.
Stephen King's It. And within It, you've got something like every 28, 29 years that it comes out and starts selling balloons or whatever it is that it does for the local children. So we can sort of like see that there's this cyclical pattern happening in the background that's kind of out of sync with anything that we would normally expect, but something that's going to be kind of devastating to the general populace.
It's a very clever way of writing something in the first person and still have that tension. Because quite often I find when I read stuff in the first person, I'm thinking, well, I know they're not going to die because they're telling me the story. Where this is actually someone reading somebody else's story. So you like I say, you're learning what this character's learning. So you become the character reading these papers, and that works really well. And yes, you're right. Stephen King's It, majorly influenced by this, definitely. I mean, especially when you get towards the end of it with the whole cosmic horror type idea of what it actually is, the stars aligning effectively with it.
Yeah.
But also, another influence that I think is definitely there is Steven Spielberg with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where when the aliens are coming, it's people start having dreams and premonitions, and they start building sculptures of the mountain that it's going to be at, and they start drawing pictures of it and stuff like that. And I think that's a direct influence from this story.
I think I'd forgotten about that actually, but it's Richard Dreyfuss, isn't he, who's building mashed potato mountains.
And it drives him mad. He's got this knowledge and he doesn't know what it is, and so he ends up building a huge one in his house. And so it drives him mad because he can't get it out of his head. And it's that whole, like I say, it's a dream that's obviously been broadcast, and the artists are the ones that pick up on it. So that's very Lovecraft.
Yeah, we've got other potential literary inspirations. Guy de Maupassant's The Hauler, which Lovecraft described as concerning an invisible being who sways the minds of others and seems to be the vanguard of a horde of extraterrestrial organisms arrived on Earth to subjugate and overwhelm mankind. That's from Lovecraft talking in supernatural horror in literature. And there's Arthur Macon's The Novel of the Black Seal, 1895, which uses the same method of piecing together of disassociated knowledge, including a random newspaper clipping to reveal the survival of a horrific ancient being. And I think this whole idea that, he could well have been inspired by things like this, but the epistolary form of storytelling has been around for so long. It's ridiculous to even sort of say, oh well, he was inspired by this particular one.
I think you've got just general, like you say, you've got general inspirations all over the place rather than being a very specific thing. I'm going to throw another one into the mix that hasn't been mentioned. This is what I do. I drive my tutors at university mad over this because I don't completely believe in if you don't have any evidence, it's wrong. I'm going to put forward H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds as another influence for this. Because, hang on, it's stuck.
Go on, your thoughts?
Yeah, so basically you're talking about a book that was published in about 1897. And it involves an ancient power from another world, and even the beginning of it, minds immeasurably superior to ours, regarded this world with envious eyes. So you've got this much greater intelligence that is coming to this planet. The description of the aliens themselves, because of gravity, they are husk-like, tentacle-like creatures that come to this planet. So there's a lot of parallels that you could easily say, well, he's read this and that's now given this idea on top of this one, and he's merged these two ideas together that then become, squeeze them out the other end, and you start getting closer to the idea of the Call of Cthulhu. And then once you've written because that's the first story of his cosmic horror ones, isn't it? Or is it Color Out of Space?
Color Out of Space, and I think Innsmouth's got sort of touches with Dagon being in there. And there are. So it's kind of part of building the mythos through. So you start somewhere, and sometimes you can start by going, you know what, I'm going to rewrite an old story I knew. I'm going to take the story and I'm going to do it my way, just as a bit of a giggle, like The Monkey's Paw 2, for example. And you end up with quite a good story. And if you end up with some nice ideas out of that, you can then move on and you can create your own universe off the back of it. So, these like you say, there are so many tropes used, which are just general story tropes that you can use in a lot of different ways. I was going to mention War of the Worlds myself. My notes are telling me that Edward Guimont has argued that War of the Worlds was an influence, citing the thematic similarities of ancient, powerful but indifferent aliens associated with deities, physical similarities, like you said, and the plot detail of a ship ramming an alien in a temporarily successful but ultimately futile gesture.
That's right, the Thunder Child, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got
So basically, there is written evidence. Damn you! Right, sorry.
Damn these researchers, yeah.
You see, but that shows how difficult it is to have an original idea.
It's assumed he got some inspiration from William Scott Eliot's The Story of Atlantis, 1896, and The Lost Lemuria, 1904, which Lovecraft read in 1926, shortly before he started to work on the story. Price also notes that Lovecraft admired the work of Lord Dunsany, who wrote The Gods of Pagana, which depicts a god constantly lulled to sleep to avoid the consequences of its reawakening. So, and another Dunsany work. Say again?
He's influenced by... Actually, I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, if I remember rightly, there was what I thought was an influence from 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights. I think it's even mentioned as an intertextual thing. You know, like the meta... like the monkey's paw, funny enough, that I just mentioned, mentions the Arabian Nights as being that sort of thing. But that's kind of like lulling a king, isn't it? You know, keep telling stories so that I don't get killed. It's the
that's Scheherazade, isn't it? Actually, people,
thieves. Yeah, it does mention it. It mentions the thief of not the thief of Baghdad, but the Night of Thousand Thieves. It mentions that in Call of Cthulhu. So yeah. It's wonderful. To be perfectly honest with you, the more we talk about it, I love intertextuality. I love huge amounts of influence on things where you can sit there and go, yeah, there is all this reading that's gone on behind it that has informed the author to be able to come up with this and then entwine all that. Because I think it adds a layer of realism into things, because these are just the books that they were reading at the time. So anyone who picks it up, you kind of have that, oh my God, it's real, because you have these things that you can relate to. I always remember The Dark, James Herbert's The Dark, when the Dark moves over a football match and there's this massive riot in the football stadium. And I'm a football fan, and it was in the 80s. And I remember I was reading The Dark at the time, and then I watched the European game with Liverpool in it at Heysel Stadium, and I watched The Dark unfold in front of me. So, you know, you kind of get this extra layer of fear, because you oh my God, they're reading the same books, oh my God, it's the same story. It becomes its own mythos at that point, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think realism is probably the key thing to what Lovecraft did, even though his stories are so out there and strange and uncanny and bizarre. The fact that we've got the academic papers of somebody who's been studying this at a serious level, and we've got the whole notion that this academic has died under potentially mysterious circumstances, but not so mysterious that there's been a police investigation. And yeah, it's realistic the way it's written.
Yes. Yeah. The writing style is, I would say, out of all the ones we've read so far, and I'm going to include Shirley Jackson in this, and I know this is older than Shirley Jackson, I actually think it's the most modern sounding in the way that the sentence structures are and all that kind of thing. Because it had that, it just flowed, rather than, it wasn't trying to be a writer. It was much more of a journal in the way that it just described things so matter of fact, and using things like undescribable and unpronounceable, and that kind of thing was just a person who is not learned of words trying to come to terms with what they've seen. And I think that adds to the surrealness in that way of it, but also the realism, because if you were faced with this thing and it's 600 foot high in front of you, it's the size of Blackpool Tower suddenly lured over the top of you, you're not going to come up with all the purple prose, are you, to be able to describe this thing? It's like, oh, he's an octopus with wings, or whatever. That's pretty much as far as you're going to get. And he does that. He does that so well. It's it's very basic, but well structured.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of fun for that, and I think again it was Stephen King who was discussing Lovecraft. Might have been Dan's Macabre many years ago, pointing out that he's created such a strange world where Cthulhu lives. The fact that it's non-Euclidean shapes, the fact that the geometry doesn't work right.
Oh, yes. And that was so good. Yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, it seems to be so terrifying to Lovecraft, the whole idea that perhaps the corner of the door isn't 90 degrees, that it's set at a different angle. Which I quite understand that. It's almost as though we've uncovered a part of Lovecraft's character where he's got OCD, and if that picture isn't hanging exactly right, there's something wrong in the room.
Yeah.
And worse than the picture not hanging right, the entire wall is off kilter, but it was designed to be off kilter. And
to the point where it looks, because he has this thing about the obtuse angle, doesn't he, where he says it's like where the angle looks like it's supposed to be obtuse but actually acts like the opposite.
Cute. Yeah.
And it's like, it was a fantastic way of putting it, because like you never think I'm walking down the road and I can walk down the road because I recognize the angles, but to not be able to walk across a room because the angle looks one thing and then isn't, and it throws him off so much that he's not able to actually make it across. That's brilliant. Yeah, that's really, really good.
Again, it gives us that insight into the insanity that these characters are suffering from, the mental issues, as you try and get your head around such a surreal concept.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And madness is what it's all about at the end of the day. You know, he is trying, I personally believe that in all the horrors that he's talking about, and he describes it as an Eldritch horror, doesn't he, at one point, as the, you know, it's so horrific, it's Eldritch. And I think I don't know whether or not he really suffered from mental illness, but it's the closest thing that I think I've read truly that gives you that distorted view of the world when you're having kind of like a psychosis, where you sometimes get it. Hangover can sometimes cause it as well, where you have that kind of feeling where you're just slightly out of your own body and the world just doesn't seem to fit. And he describes that so well without it being nonsense, because Lewis Carroll does the nonsense thing. Nonce, as you're going to say, is the most important word in that. But he does the kind of nonsense thing where, you know, the world is obviously different, you know, and even Poe, when he goes into that, Poe's very much more a depressed type thing, and all his language is about being down and having the emotions of not feeling right with everything like that. But I think Lovecraft definitely comes in with this notion of it's just not right, and how to describe that feeling of the world just not be, you are sat in this world and it's not right. And I think that, yeah, that's that. I forgot to mention that was one of the things that I was making notes for, that my cold has allowed me to forget somewhere. But yeah, it was such a wonderful description of how the world was just completely obtuse and queer.
Yeah, queer. That word kept popping up again and again, and I appreciate. Back when he was writing this, queer didn't necessarily come across as a slur against somebody for their sexuality, but we can see how it does develop like that. First of all, we've got sort of like, I think the first description is a queer-looking sailor or something along those lines, and it's meant as in a peculiar-looking or a.
Well, it's the way. I mean, to be brutally honest with you, and I will be very, very honest, is I still use that word in that context. In that, you know, if I'm feeling a little bit ill, I might describe myself occasionally as I'm just feeling a bit queer this morning. And because my brain doesn't register as that. And, you know, I understand that people from the homosexual community like to use the word queer for themselves because it was used against them in the way that a lot of slurs, and they own that. And absolutely, no problem with that. But in my head, the word queer also uses for that as well. You know, it hasn't completely slipped over and can still sit within that. However, I do understand that younger readers might not get that, and they might giggle a bit too much at it because of the way he says it so much. Like ejaculation, you can't keep using that one. I'd love to still use that one, but you know.
But we can sort of like see how he's describing some of the sailors as being a little bit queer, almost as though it's an offhand, oh, there's just something a little bit odd about them.
Yes.
But then it moves on, and we've got sort of like queer being related to the orgies, and queer being related to some of the much more sinister things.
But again, it's still to do with the oddity of it. That's the whole thing reads as that, I think, where it is definitely being used as something that you don't see every day, rather than it being in any other context. As in, oh, you know, I saw this man hanging around the back of the house who was acting awfully queer. You know, it's that.
Yes.
That kind. It's very posh as well, to be perfectly honest with you. So it's definitely a class thing, I think. But
I suppose, yeah, there is a certain level of poshness to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially it just struck me that
he did use it in a way that I never used it myself or actually heard anybody use it, which is queered. He actually says something was queered to make it say that it was made of.
Yeah, which is kind of odd and would potentially fit in with his right-wing politics. But I'm not into Lovecraft bashing. I'm not into
No, I mean, you've got to. Sometimes you can separate the art from the artist, and I think you have.
Exactly.
I think it's like with Lewis Carroll. It's like with Enid Blyton. It's like with Agatha Christie. It's, you know, you can do this whole list of various. I'd even go as far as saying, you know, H.G. Wells is one of my favorite authors of all time. I try my utmost to not read about his real life, you know, because he was into eugenics and you know, that kind of thing. I much prefer the stuff that he's written and not trying to like darken my days with the with all the stuff going on behind, you know.
Yes, I'm with you on that. And it's like with people nowadays with J.K. Rowling, who have sort of like got this association with her and a turf mentality. But yeah, that doesn't mean that the Harry Potter stories are any less entertaining just because
it also means that from gang culture, you know, this is, you know, when everyone talks about, you know, appropriation, right?
Yeah.
In gang culture, when you had a territory that was yours and the other gang was coming over, you had a turf war. That's now being stolen. So, you know, where do these words stop? Because, you know, turf was the place where you had your gang and it was your area and you defended it. You know, now it's middle-aged women on Mumsnet that don't agree with the modern interpretation of gender politics.
It's spelled different.
Oh, you're talking to a dyslexic. How am I going to know?
Well, it was turf, TURF, like turf for lawn, and
it does.
Yeah, but
and they could spell queer differently, and nobody would know. I know it isn't.
Yeah, I mean,
they could.
I mean, I saw that sign today. Somebody saying "no fuel" with fuel spelled FLUE. Sorry, FULE, which is not how most people spell it.
No. But these things happen, don't they? I mean, look, it's very much of its time. I think it can be modernized. And I think if an author came along and wrote, I don't know, a series of 6 books, for example, that were kind of based on the H.P. Lovecraft universe, and called them, I don't know, off the top of my head, something like The Dark Tales of Innsmouth, you know, something like that. Then, oh my goodness, what? Escape! Look at that,
yeah. They could escape with that piece of literature. Yes, what a gorgeous cover that is.
It is. Though be warned, actually, if you read the blurb on the back of that book, you've actually got to pull it out. It's on a continuous piece of paper to explain the whole story. But no, but the whole thing is I appreciate what you did there, and actually going back to the influences when we were discussing influences before, where you've taken H.P. Lovecraft as an influence. You've almost started with a joke where you've gone, it's H.P. Lovecraft, but without the racism. And then, but that in itself is enough of a premise to get you going, to say, I want to write H.P. Lovecraft, but I'm going to write it without the racism. Because we are now writing in this time, and you don't do that in this time. And that, you know, that makes perfect sense to do that. And I would have no objection whatsoever if someone did an edit of the H.P. Lovecraft stories and took out those, even though they're historical words, but actually took them out if they wanted to make it to a wider audience, and actually changed queer for odd, and actually changed Negro for person of color, then, you know, to take away that cynicism of it. Yes, it might lose something in terms of its historical reference for the time it is set, but at the same time, I think more younger audiences would appreciate it more and wouldn't be turned off by it, and then be able to allow themselves to see the ideas behind all that, because it's such a small part of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, question time.
Question time.
Question time. What's the book for next week?
What are we reading next week? Right, okay. As you know, I've not started it yet. I'm actually getting a website together called Haunted Manor, which is going to publish all the public domain stories that we talk about. And I'm going to be collecting lots of old public domain ghost stories because you've reignited, this whole thing has reignited my love for the old ghost stories. And that's what I wanted to say earlier, because you showed the cover of Weird Times, which...
Tales.
Sorry? Weird Tales, that's it. And Weird Tales is the original name for horror stories. They weren't called horror stories. So back in the Victorian times, they were called Weird Tales or Weird Stories. And there's a lot of women used to write a lot of weird stories, and they're known as the Weird Women. And there's a couple of anthologies now that you can get that have these old stories in them. So I, of course, have now got into all of this. So I have picked the old nurse's story, by Elizabeth Gaskell.
Right, I've not come across this one at all.
Very interesting thing to say about a female author.
The old nurse's story.
Yes. This is just dripping in classic Victorian ghost story. I think you're going to really love it.
I'm looking forward to it. Yes. Brilliant, right? Yeah, that's one I am definitely looking forward to reading.
Yes,
and I think we'll probably come back to Lovecraft again one day in the future, because I think he's written far too much for us just to dismiss him with one book.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we're going to also look at Jules Verne and H.G. Wells in that as well, especially because I think where he talks about futurism in this, I think you can see his links to H.G. as well in terms of, you know, being a sort of contemporary of writing science fiction at the time. So I think there's definitely, and we've got to do Mountains of Madness. We have to read them out.
Yes.
Yeah. But next week we're going to do Elizabeth Gaskell. Okay.
And I'm glad we're getting on to another female writer as well, because it's been a bit of a sausage fest apart from Shirley Jackson, hasn't it? Yeah,
and to be perfect, where it's reignited my love for this, and I'm going back and finding them all, and he's sort of, like I said to you before, there's stuff that I've read that I don't remember, and then I start reading it again and going, oh, I've read this, because my dad was he was such an avid. My mother and father were both avid readers, and my dad used to like all these little horror stories. So there were always these little books lying around the house that were full of short stories and horror stories, and I used to read them like crazy. Because being dyslexic, I can't read normally, so I used to devour these things. But I couldn't tell you what any of them were called until we come across them. It's like, oh wow, I remember this now. So it's quite nice because I'm now putting names to stories that I read years ago. So, and this is one of them. This is definitely one of them where I thought, I'm going to look up some of these weird women, because I thought we needed some more women. And I started reading the story. And I know this, and I thought, oh, is it just a cliched story? And you're like me, we don't believe in cliches; they're just tropes. And I thought, God, is this a bit... And then he realised that it's written in the 1800s, this story. And it's like, modern readers would probably read it and go, oh, it was very predictable and all that kind of stuff. But I think you just got to get rid of all that and try and put yourself back in the day when people used to sit round campfires or fires at Christmas. And the tradition of reading ghost stories to each other on Boxing Day, for example, is a classic Victorian tradition. And that's where this story comes from. It comes from that ilk.
Really looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again, sir. I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Love that. Yes, absolutely. Anybody who's listening, please hit the like button, share, subscribe, tell people about it. Yes, and look out. Whatever.
When Haunted Manor goes up, I will put the web address on so that you can go there, because, like I say, everything we read is public domain. and I like that as a thing. And and so as long as we can publish it as public domain, we'll put it up on this website, as well as some of our own ghost stories occasionally as well, which will be quite fun. But the whole thing is, we're just having too much fun doing this, and so we want to keep doing it. So keep liking it, please.
Yes. So thank you, everybody.
No worries.
See you next week.
Bye now. That's the wrong button.